As you know, I am Mark Chupp from the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, and I am really pleased today to welcome our colleague, Congressman Louis Stokes, here to present on advocacy and the role of citizens in affecting, and social workers in particular, in affecting public decisions. By way of introduction, I'd like to say a few things. I could go on and on about Congressman Stokes, but former U.S. Representative Louis Stokes played a pivotal role in the quest for civil rights, equality, and social and economic justice throughout his tenure in the United States Congress. Congressman Stokes was educated in the Cleveland Public Schools and graduated from Central High School. Following 3 years of service in the United States Army, he returned to Cleveland and attended Western Reserve University, and he earned his law's degree from Cleveland Marshall Law School in 1953. Prior to serving in Congress, he practiced law for 14 years and was one of the founders of Stokes, Character, Terry, Perry, Whitehead, Young, and Davidson Law Firm. And as a practicing lawyer, he participated in 3 cases in the United States Supreme Court and argued the landmark stop and frisk case of Terry versus Ohio. On November 6, 1968, he was elected to the United States Congress and became the first African-American member of Congress from the state of Ohio. He served 15 consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, ranking 11th overall in House seniority. During his tenure in Congress, he chaired several important committees, including most notably the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Ethics Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, and one we'll surely hear about today, the Appropriations Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, HUD, and independent agencies. He was the Dean of the Ohio Congressional Congress delegation and a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And he served on the House Select Committee to investigate covert arms. Following his service in Congress, he became senior counsel at Squire Sanders Dempsey, a global law firm, and distinguished visitor here at the visiting professor here at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. He's also served as vice chairman of the Pew Environmental Health Commission at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and was appointed by former Health and Human Services Secretary Donna Shalala as chairman of the Advisory Committee on Minority Health. Throughout his years, Congressman Stokes has received numerous awards, too many to mention, and honors that recognize his national leadership and strong commitment to public service. As we know, there are a number of landmarks around the city that bear his name and the name of his brother, the first African-American mayor of a large American city. So it's my pleasure and honor and privilege to introduce Congressman Stokes. So let's welcome him.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Professor Chupp. I appreciate those very warm and kind words of introduction. And it's a pleasure to be back in your class again. Each year I look forward to having the opportunity to come back here and share with your students some of the insights into the legislative process in the Congress. And so I come here today sort of eager to share with you something that I think will be of value to you as social workers. Obviously, this is a policy class, and the purpose of it is that they want you as social workers, if you are going to be effective, particularly in the areas of advocacy and working on behalf of your clients, you have to understand the legislative policy process, and you have to understand how policy is made. When I went to Congress, I was probably like many of you are. I had been a lawyer for 14 years. I had specialized as a trial lawyer. I think they call them litigators today. At that time, they referred to them as trial lawyers. But I had never served in a legislative body. And so I really, other than what I'd learned in high school and in a couple of undergraduate courses about Congress and the Constitution, I really had very little understanding of how legislation is passed. And then when you talk about passing legislation, we're talking about passing legislation in the greatest legislative body in the world. The United States Congress is the world's greatest legislative body. The members of the United States Congress hold the next highest office to the President and the Vice President of the United States. At the federal level, there is no higher office than those two offices than that of the Congress. Consists of two bodies. We don't refer to it here as they do in the Parliament in England, where they refer to it as the upper house and the lower house. Here, both houses are equal. In one house, the House of Representatives, we have a total of 435 representatives from around the nation, representing the 50 states. And in the United States Senate, you have a much smaller group. You have 100 senators, each of them representing a state. The representatives, of course, represent congressional districts within a state. In terms of passing legislation, and that's what you go to Congress for. Now, I admit you don't see very much of that going on today, but that's what you were sent to Congress for. The term representative to Congress is what appears on the ballot, where people vote against the name Louis Stokes. It says representative to Congress. So that's your role. And that's what you went to Congress to do, was to try to change policy. And you do that through legislation. When I went to Congress in January of 1969, I had just come out of not only the practice of law, but the civil rights movement. Very active in the civil rights movement here in Cleveland. I represented most of those who were active and those who were being thrown in jails and who were being persecuted in many ways for fighting for and trying to eliminate discrimination and segregation right here in our own city of Cleveland. The year before I went to Congress, my brother Carl had been elected as the first black mayor of a major American city. He had been elected the mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. And 1 year later, I was elected to the Congress. And so I went to Congress with the idea in mind that I had to try to change conditions as I saw them in the city in which I lived and the city which I now represent in the United States Congress. And so I went there wanting to really learn, how do I learn to be a good legislator so that I can affect conditions in the kind of a congressional district that I represented. Now, my congressional district, when I first went to Congress, was basically the whole city of Cleveland on the east side. Didn't represent any part of the west side. All the east side, a part of East Cleveland, and then I had a little juggernaut section of the district, which was Garfield Heights. When you looked at my congressional district, it was one where in the central city itself, most of the poverty existed. 3 areas in particular, Huff area, Fairfax area, the central area, three of the most poverty-stricken areas anywhere in the country. I wanted to do something about that, concerned about that. Many of the people in my congressional district got their health care in emergency rooms in the hospitals in the center of the city. It had a high concentration of seniors who were particularly concerned about living conditions, about crime, about Social Security and other needs that they had. And so this was a district that was ripe for any kind of change I could bring to the city. So in that sense, after I served my first term in the Congress, I was able to get on the Appropriations Committee of the House. Fortunately, I got in there in my very second term in the Congress, and I was the first black representative in the history of the United States Congress to go on the Appropriations Committee. Why was that important? It was because at the time I went on appropriations, no African Americans had ever served on appropriations, the Rules Committee, or the Ways and Means Committee. Now, those are the three most powerful committees in the Congress. There are a lot of committees there, but those three are where the power is lodged. And so, working with the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, we were able to break that ice by getting me on the Appropriations Committee. And then we moved to get Charlie Rangel on the Ways and Means Committee, Charlie Rangel of New York, and a lady by the name of Shirley Chisholm, who we got on the Rules Committee. Shirley Chisholm represented New York, and she was the first black woman to ever come into the Congress, and she came in with me the same day I came in January of 1969. And so once we had been able to break into the power base of the Congress, I was then in a position to start being able to do something about those conditions that I saw and lived with in my congressional district, and where I could effectuate change. Now, sitting on the Appropriations Committee, I understood and I learned the process, because when I first went on there, they put me in the last position on the Democratic side. There were, at that time, 54 members of the committee, and I think there were 30 Democrats. The rest were Republicans. And of course, I was put in the 30th position. So it meant I had to try and get reelected a whole lot of times in order to move up the ladder on that Appropriations Committee in order to be able to get more power. As the 30th member on the committee, I had very little power, but I was there, and that was the important thing. And so I could then start looking forward to how do I best place myself on committees within the Appropriations Committee. And one of the committees I chose was called Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education. That's tailor-made for my congressional district, to be able to sit there and be able to put money into all of those kinds of areas that directly affect my constituency. At the same time, the other side of the House in terms of committee service are the authorizing committees. Now, those are the committees that once they hear legislation, they enact a bill, and it's called an authorizing bill. On our side, on the Appropriations Committee, when we put out a bill, it's called an appropriations bill. We take the authorizing bill and we examine it and we determine how much money will be put into the authorization bill. And there will be a ceiling and a floor in the authorizing bill of how much we can and how little we can't put into that bill. And so in between, you try to work that process out. Now, in addition to it, as a legislator, I had to learn how to do things that my constituents wanted me to do. Your constituents write your letters and they complain about certain things, but many of them give you suggestions as to what you can do as a legislator in order to alleviate some kind of a problem that they see. And to that degree, we pay a lot of attention to our constituents because in many cases, they have excellent ideas. They may not know exactly how to word it or how it should be put in legislative form, but they do know what the outcome should be. And so what you would do as a legislator is you sit down with your staff and you look at the suggestion. And then you try to formulate a legislative approach which incorporates policy around that particular idea or suggestion. Then, once you and your staff have developed a piece of legislation, you send it down to an office there where they put together a piece of legislation that's known as a bill. And I brought a bill here today so you'd have some idea of what a bill looks like, and I want to talk about a bill a little bit. It says H.R. 1895, to amend the Public Health Service Act to revise and extend programs relating to the health of individuals who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, including individuals who are members of racial or ethnic minority groups. Down here it says, a bill to amend the Public Health Service Act to revise and extend programs relating to the health of individuals who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, including individuals who are members of racial or ethnic minority groups, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. I must have 50 or 60 co-signers. And it says there, Mr. Stokes for himself, and then it names all the other representatives from the various states. What is important here is that I'm attempting to, in some manner, be able to have the Public Health Act of 1954 be able to do more to help eliminate disparities in health care in the United States. I recite in the bill what the conditions are with reference to health disparities and how minorities die earlier, how they suffer greater degree in disease and at a different disparity in terms of the white and black ratio in healthcare in America. And so it's important to me when I introduce this bill to not just introduce the bill that says right there, introduced by Mr. Stokes for himself. With all of these co-signers, what happens is that the other members see that this is a bill Stokes is serious about. He's evidently introduced his bill with 60 co-signers. And so that means right away, they look down and try to find people in the Congress whom they vote like and whom they philosophically are akin to. And once they see their name, then it's very easy for them to say, well, I want to be on this bill too. But it takes time to do this. So what you have to do is have your staff work the phones. They call up the offices on both sides. Don't just call the Democrats. They call Republicans and Democrats and say, my boss is introducing a bill that we think your boss would like to be a part of. And the staffers generally work it out, talk to their members, and then they come back and say, well, Mr. Wen of Missouri also wants to be a co-sponsor on that legislation. One of the bills I'm going to refer to here in a few moments has about 77 pages in that one bill. But that's a bill that I'll explain to you when I get to it. It's brought out by a chairman. But now what does it mean if I'd go down and I walk over to the hopper. If you watched on TV and you've seen where the president stands at the podium in the House, well, right down on the edge of those ledges like you see here is what they call a hopper. And so you introduce your bill by dropping it in the hopper. That bill is then picked up by the clerks later in the day, and it's taken to the committee that it's assigned to. Just like on here, the House bill I talked to you about says, introduce the following bill, which was referred to the Committee on Commerce. Now, does that mean the fact that Louis Stokes dropped a bill in the hopper today, does that mean that that bill is going to be a law? No, that's right. If you're shaking your head, you're right. It doesn't. It requires a lot of work to get that bill passed. You have to understand the committee system. A chairman of a committee is a powerful person in the Congress, be it a man or a woman. If you chair a committee, you have all the power. You'll determine whether Stokes' bill ever gets considered or heard by anybody. And so you have to understand the process. If you really have legislation that you want to pass, then you've got to do politicking. Not only do you have to go to people, as I did here, and ask them to become co-sponsors. That means I carry this many votes when I introduce the bill. And it's different from introducing a bill with just one vote on it, which doesn't signify that this is a very strong bill at all. On the latter bill, I'm going to show you for a minute, I have 150 co-sponsors to the bill, and which means I only need 218 votes to pass the bill. So if I have 150 when I introduce it, then I'm in good shape in terms of passage of that bill. Now, many congresspersons introduce hundreds of bills, and many of them never pass a bill. There's an art to passing legislation. And now, once I introduce this bill, and it goes to the Commerce Committee, that bill then comes under the jurisdiction of the chairman, as I've said before. Now, the chairman is not likely, unless this is really something along the lines of his philosophy and something he wants, is not likely to take that bill up. So it means that I have to find a way to get my bill to the attention of that chairman. And so chairmen are very busy people. So my calling him up and asking if I can have an appointment in his office is going to take up his time in his office when he has very little time. He has constituents sitting out there in the office. He's got phone calls from his district, and as a chairman, he has other high responsibilities. And so the smartest way for me to be able to talk to the chairman is take advantage when we have a roll call. And all the members go over to the House and we all are voting. The members tend to sit around once they get on the floor and just chat with one another. And so you use that opportunity to walk over to the chairman, sit down next to him. Mr. Chairman, how are you doing today? And then you inquire as to how his wife and children are, and a little bit about their college educations and how well they're doing in school. And after you've had a nice, friendly chat with the chairman, you say, Mr. Chairman, I've got a bill that's over before your committee. I really wish you could take a look at it, Mr. Chairman. It's a great piece of legislation. Let me tell you what it does. And then I talk to him about the national situation involving minority health and how the Congress, if they amend the Public Health Act, can really enlarge upon some opportunities for us to be able eventually to eliminate these disparities in our country. This has national appeal. Chairman probably will say, okay, Stokes, I'll take a look at it, send it over. So I go back to my office. I write him a nice letter. Dear Mr. Chairman, it's nice chatting with you on the floor today. And pursuant to our conversation, I'm enclosing my bill, which is before your committee. I hope that you will take a look at it, and I'll be glad to work with your staff in terms of hearings. In most cases, that type of an approach will help tremendously for him to at least take your bill and refer it to his staff and say, take a look at this and see what you recommend. And then, of course, you have your staff talk with their staff, his staff. And so that way you're building something between yourself and the chairman and between your staff and the chairman's staff. And so the next thing you know, you'll get a call saying the chairman's going to hold hearings on your bill. Now, the only thing is, it's no longer my bill. The chairman, when he starts hearings on it, makes it his bill. Now, he's that powerful that he takes the Stokes bill and it becomes, let's say his name is Chairman Duran. It becomes Chairman Duran's bill. What they will do is let me come over and sit down and be the lead witness on that legislation the day that they hear it. And so I can do that, and I can also produce witnesses, expert witnesses who will come in and testify on that legislation. Over the years when I was in Congress, one of the things I delighted in doing oftentimes was bringing in experts from Case Western Reserve University in order to testify. And because not only did they testify as to what was happening in my congressional district, but it gave me a chance to bring in and show off experts from my congressional district. And so at any rate, what you have to do, once they have hearings on the bill, then they vote on this bill. Now, when they vote on the bill, you have a chance to amend the bill. The chairman will assemble his committee, and they sit at the table, and he will entertain amendments to his bill. If he doesn't like the amendment, he will try to get the committee to defeat the amendment. If he likes it, he may just accept it. But anyway, you go through that process in order to get the bill out of committee. Now, once it's come out of committee, the bill then goes to the full authorizing or the full appropriations committee. And then they will do the same thing with the bill. The full committee will get a chance to try and amend the bill or change it in whatever way they can. This is a very interesting process when you see amendments to a bill, because some people, their amendments are to destroy the bill. If it's a bill they don't like, then all their amendments are to destroy or change provisions in the bill in a way that will make the bill ineffective even if it's passed. And so getting a bill through committee, even as a chairman, requires skill to preserve those provisions in the bill and really make it effective. Now, many times Congress passes bad bills. There have oftentimes I've had to stand on the floor and say, how do I vote for this? And the reason you have that type of indecision about it is because sometimes they put in the bill what we call a sweetener. They put sugar in it in the sense that they put something in there that affects your district in a way where you can't vote against something that's going to affect your district. But in order to get it, you've got to take all this bad stuff in the bill. And so those are tough ones where you hold your nose and you go ahead and vote yes on the bill. But let's assume now that a bill has gone through this Commerce Committee, and then it goes to their full Commerce Committee, out of a subcommittee rather into the full committee. Now, and let's say they pass the Stokes bill. Now, it still doesn't become law. What you do then, you have to go to, remember I told you about the Rules Committee, how powerful they are. They're powerful because after a bill has gone through all this hearing process, all this amendment process, all of this voting process, it still has to go to the Rules Committee to determine whether it can go to the floor or not, to be voted on by the full House. There they have the power to take this bill that's been worked on by all these members and developed and fashioned. Now they will determine whether it goes to the floor or not. If it goes to the floor, they will determine whether you can amend all of the bill or parts of the bill or no parts of the bill. They will determine how long the bill can be debated on the floor. That's a lot of power. Let's say then that, and they've listened to opponents of the bill, and they listen to proponents of the bill. And they decide that the bill should go to the floor. And they'll design how long it can be debated and whether it can be amended, what parts of the bill, and so forth. So they pass the bill out, and the bill then finally goes to the floor. Now, once it goes to the floor, you got 435 members who are going to be voting on that legislation. And that's why one of the things that I told you about, if I've got a bill where I've got 150 co-signers on my bill, then it means I've worked the body pretty well, and then all I've got to do is try and work some others to be sure I get the full 218 votes that I need for passage. And many times you just have to work the floor and talk to as many people as you can. And that means one of the things that I learned early, I was a Democrat, but I also understood that the body was made up of Democrats and Republicans. And if you've got a good bill, that you ought to try and get members from both parties to support you, support your legislation. And this was the way I was successful in being able to pass a lot of legislation, because I understood that I needed that type of support on legislation. And so that was the way I approached it. Now, the bill then goes to the floor, and it's debated on the floor, it's amended, and it passes in the House. So now what happens? The House has passed the bill, but nothing's happened in the Senate. So the Senate then has to go through the same identical process that the House underwent, and they pass a bill. Now, in all probability, when they pass their bill, the two bills are going to mesh in many respects, but there'll be some provisions in both bills that are not the same. As a consequence of it, in order to get a law, you have to be able to get a bill in which both the House and Senate members have agreed. And so after the Senate passes their bill, you then go to what we call conference. And conference is a very interesting place because the senators sit on one side of the table, House members sit on the other side, those from the committee that produced the bill. And you then discuss those provisions in the two bills that are different. And many times you agree, many times you don't agree. I have sat in House-Senate conferences, particularly on appropriation bills, for as long as 6 months, meeting regularly, but being unable to pass certain provisions of those bills. I remember particularly when we had abortion provisions on our appropriations bill. And the senators nor the House members could agree upon certain provisions related to abortion. And we'd settle all of the money issues in the bill, but we couldn't settle those provisions. And I remember one time one of the senators pulled out a Bible, and is chairman of the Senate committee, and pulled out his Bible, and he sat there and he read out loud the Bible all that day until finally the chairman of our subcommittee moved that we adjourn or recess the hearing. And they would do any kind of delaying tactics until somebody would break and they could be able to agree upon those provisions. But now let's say that the conference decides, they work it out, they drop certain provisions, the House yields to the Senate on certain passages, Senate does that for the House on certain passages. They arrive at a bill that is the same on both sides. You then take the bill back to the House and the Senate, vote upon it again. Then the bill goes down to the president for his signature. The president then has the option of signing it or vetoing it. And he can veto it by hand, or he can let it sit in his pocket for 10 days and it's automatically vetoed. And if that happens, veto, the bill comes back to the House and the Senate, and then you try again to override the president's veto, which is much more difficult because now you've got to get 2/3 vote in order to be able to override the president's veto. And so that gives you some glimpse into the legislative process. Now, affecting the process that we've just discussed going through, people who lobby against legislation. The best example I can give you is one that you can read about every day and watch on your TVs every night when you hear all the debate about the about the gun lobby and about gun legislation. Now, we're all familiar with the incident that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. It's a great tragedy when these young elementary students had their lives taken by automatic weapons. You would think that in 2013, when you see a tragedy of that sort take place with little innocent elementary school children, it would be very easy to pass legislation banning that type of weapon from our society. But far from the truth, with some of the most powerful people in the country supporting legislation to ban these type of guns and these type of cartridges that hold 120 bullets that just are fired in rapid order, you would think that it would just be a cinch to have people react as we all did in horror at what we saw at Sandy Hook. But this morning's Washington Post, when I came out of Washington, D.C. this morning, great story on the legislative process and what is happening with that legislation. There's 16 senators who are up for election, re-election rather, in 2014. And they represent conservative states. And there are two provisions in that gun legislation, that is the bills that are now before the Senate. And one of the provisions is requiring background checks for anyone purchasing automatic weapons. Now, you would think that there's nothing wrong if they're legitimate people and they're not criminals and they want automatic weapons, that they ought to be able to subject themselves to a background search. But the National Rifle Association contends that this would be a sort of registry of guns, that it would identify who in the country owns guns and what type of guns they do, and therefore that it is not consistent with American tradition and policy, and therefore such a provision should be banned from the bill. The other provision that caused a great deal of concern is where they would ban the cartridges for these automatic weapons, where the cartridges hold all those weapons where you just walk into a room, as has been done, and you start firing, and it doesn't stop firing to start killing people. And so you would think that that would be a provision that even if you believe in the Second Amendment, even if you believe the Constitution under the Second Amendment gives you the right to bear weapons, and it does. It does. The Constitution does provide that. And so those who hunt and are sportsmen, but you'd ask yourself, do they really need something of that nature in order to be able to hunt ducks and geese and deer and other things that are hunted? And so the National Rifle Association has struck fear in members of the House and Senate, and particularly in the current climate where you have an extreme right of Tea Partiers who have been able to elect many members of the House and the Senate, and who are very strong politically. And so in that climate, you get a good example of the power of lobbying. And now lobbying is not all bad. All of you as students here become members of the National Association of Social Workers. Great organization. They lobby hard in Washington on behalf of the interests of social workers. They're very capable, very able in terms of having persons who are not social workers understand the problems related to social work. Now, in the same category, I want to talk a little bit about some of the laws, after we've talked about the president signing a law and that type of thing. Sometimes Congress passes an act that we call an unfunded mandate. An unfunded mandate is where the Congress passes a law, and that is the authorizing committee passes the law, but then the appropriators don't put any money into the authorized bill. And so the authorized bill becomes law and is signed by the president, and becomes a law, but there's no money in the bill. Now, that's what happened with Leave No Child Behind legislation. That's the best example I can think of. I recall President Bush, who had been the sponsor of that legislation. And he had gone around the country lobbying on behalf of that legislation and urging constituents to press their legislators to pass Leave No Child Behind. And then when the act was passed, that morning he got on a plane and went around the country announcing the fact that the Congress had passed his legislation, that this was going to be the greatest change in education in decades. And lo and behold, there's no money in the bill. And so what happens in states is once a bill is passed affecting a state and there's no money in the bill, then the states are not likely to put money into the bill because they claim they don't have the funding for it. And so, or often sometimes we even put money into a bill and we didn't put enough money in the bill for the states to carry out that legislation. Now, we remedy that sometimes by coming back with what we call a supplemental bill, supplemental piece of legislation in which you try to remedy the fact that you underfunded that legislation. And of course, there's always a risk in that because when you bring a supplemental bill in, even though it's for education, people try to get amendments on that bill for anything else they have a special interest in. And so that's basically, I think, what I want to talk to you about. I just want to add another provision here, and I know Professor Chupp wants me to talk about, because he's heard me talk before about the deplorable state of affairs in the current Congress. Every day you read about it, every night you see it on your TVs. But you see the impasse that now exists between Republicans and Democrats. And it has gotten worse over the years. I left Congress in 1999. But it was growing then. It had begun in 1994 when the Republicans took over the Congress. And they had been out of power for 40 years. Now understand me, being the minority for 40 years in the Congress is tough service. When you're in a minority party, you are not treated well, you're not given all your rights, you're fighting all the time to be able to preserve your rights as the minority party in the Congress. And, but in '94, when they took over, they'd been out of power so long that, number one, they hadn't had the opportunity to manage a Congress in 40 years. And then many of them wanted retribution rather than legislation. And so it was rough. I remember I had a very close friend in Congress, Jerry Lewis of California. Jerry was a Republican. We served on the VA HUD, Independent Agency Subcommittee. That's the committee that I chaired, and he was my ranking member on the Republican side. And then when he became chairman, I was his ranking member on the Democratic side. But we were very close friends. And but when they took over, I noticed a difference in the way he treated me as a ranking member from the way I treated him as a ranking member. And I remember I had to start just being obstructionist to things he was doing, which was not like he and I had operated as in my chairmanship. And then I remember one day Jerry came over to me and said, "Lou, can I talk with you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can we go to lunch and I want to talk to you about some things." So I said, "Sure." And so we agreed to set up a date to go to lunch, and we did. And we got to lunch, he apologized for the things, the way he had conducted his chairmanship with me, because he acknowledged the great friendship we had. We've traveled over many parts of Europe together and things in our congressional capacity. And he explained to me that Newt Gingrich, who had come in as the Speaker of the House, had forbade them to have social relationship with the Democrats, and he wanted them to prevent us from participating in conferences and things of the sort. That is, they wanted to go to conference by themselves, be able to confer on legislation, decide on legislation, and then come out and tell us what they had done, rather than having us sit there and participate as they had done under our chairmanships. And so the bottom line was that along with his apology, he assured me he was going to run that committee different, and we weren't going to have the kind of difficulties we had been having. But this is the kind of thing that I saw occurring. First place, you don't really have a lot of time to get to know one another in the Congress. Everybody is really busy. One of the polls taken one year, reports came out, showed that you have about 20 minutes in a day, in about a 16-hour day. You have about 20 minutes just to yourself. The best way we would get to know one another and to really find out how nice other people were that you perhaps didn't have any opinion of, or perhaps might have had a unfavorable opinion of, was when we traveled together on congressional trips. That was where you really got a chance to learn about members, and many friendships sprung up from that. So I've watched it from afar now. I've been retired 13 years from the Congress. And, but I'll tell you, the night I sat in my TV watching the President of the United States speak at a joint session of the Congress, and I saw a member of Congress call out and call the President a liar, when he said, "You lie." The people who taught me, some of the great congresspersons who mentored me and taught me how to be a congressman, and the decorum with which I was to conduct myself as a congressman, would turn over in their graves. They couldn't believe that something like this happened in the House of Representatives. I watched some of the language, the manner of disrespect between them on each side now. The fact that no one takes anybody's word anymore. It used to be a time when your word was your bond in terms of what you would do legislatively. And I took a lot of pride in working with both members of the House. A piece of legislation here I have was the last bill that I, let's see. Yeah, the last bill that I enacted in the House just before I left in 1999, which was during the impeachment hearings of President Clinton. But right before that, bill I had passed was H.R. 1635. And this is the one on which I had 150 co-sponsors. And the bill was to establish within the United States National Park Service the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Program. And it was myself and 149 other co-sponsors. And basically, the bill was to be able to preserve many of the underground railroad sites. As you know, back during the time of Civil War and earlier, many of the slaves who escaped from the South and came to northern states did so by virtue of an underground railroad that was comprised really of whites and blacks working together in order to bring slaves out of slavery. And there are many of those underground sites around the country today, but they needed to be preserved because many of them were about to become extinct. Many of them had not been preserved carefully and things of the sort. So this legislation was to preserve all of these historic sites throughout our country by having the National Park Service take over the funding and the restoration with reference to them. And the bill came to me by Senator Portman, who was in the Congress today, in the Senate today, and he was in the House at that time. And he had tried to get the legislation through and had run into difficulty and couldn't pass it. And so he came to me and asked me if I would take the bill, and he would be the co-sponsor and see if we could get it passed. And of course, that's what I said. We started out with Mr. Stokes, and the next name is Mr. Portman. But that was the kind of thing I enjoyed doing, working with members on the other side. Senator Portman and I today are the finest of friends. Senator Voinovich, another legislator whom he was Republican, I was Democrat, but we worked together on many things that affect this community. Before we open it up for questions, I just want to say this. Social workers, to me, are very much like elected officials. I went to Congress to try to change things. I was concerned about the community in which I lived, and I was concerned about conditions in our country. In the 30 years that I was there, I was able to help make a lot of changes in our country. Anytime I passed one bill, it affected every person in America. As much as I love being a lawyer and being in the courts, I could affect only one or two people in any case I handled. But I could pass one piece of legislation and affect everybody in America. You are social workers. You care about the same kinds of things that I care about. You care about justice in our country. You care about adequate and good health. You care about decent housing. You care about safety and people being able to move around in a community. And in order to be good social workers, you're going to have to do like I did in the Congress. You have to really learn your craft and work at your craft. And one of the things that I'm so happy that Professor Chupp and the other professors who are helping train you know and understand that if you're going to be good social workers and good advocates on behalf of the clients that you represent, you have to know and understand the legislative process. You have to know and understand how to go into a congressional office and be able to talk to them about legislation pending that social workers feel would help in their field. You have to know how to advocate. You have to know why you're advocating. You have to understand how that process works. That article in the Washington Post today talked about a lady who came in right after the National Rifle Association representative had been there. And so this staff member was then sort of, and she had been one of the mothers who had lost a child. And he was lecturing her on about the provisions of the bill that shouldn't be in the bill and this and that. And they got into quite a repartee there between them. And then she said she realized that she had gotten in there after the NRA person had been there. So it made it her difficulty in trying to lobby on behalf of the banning of these guns. And it was tough on her because she had a child lost by that. While he's sitting up there telling her about provisions of the bill, she was thinking about the child she lost. And so as social workers, you have a chance to help change things as I've had a chance to change things. And so I commend you, and I think that you're very fortunate to be students in this school. It's one of the top 10 social work schools in the nation. It is the top social work school in the state of Ohio. And so you are prime. You're very special students. You have to understand the type of things that Professor Chupp and the other professors are teaching you. Because when you leave here, greater responsibility is on you because you've been taught by the best, and you've been taught to be the best. If you have any questions, I'll try and answer.
Maybe one that you might even regret.
So the question is, just for the sake of the microphone and the video, when you referred to sweeteners, is there a bill that you had a very difficult time signing on to, and or maybe even regret having signed on to, because of that whole dynamic of what gets put in a bill?
I think maybe the Welfare Reform Act. Now, in a district like mine, say Cleveland, Ohio, have a large number of people who are dependent upon federal aid. And I'm concerned about it because I grew up in the housing projects in Cleveland with a mother who was on federal aid, was on welfare as well as being a domestic worker. And so I knew and understood what poverty is about, and I knew and understood that as opposed to what many legislators claim is that people are lazy and that they don't want to work, that's not true. I knew that people, the majority of people, as opposed to arguments that we heard in debate, the majority of people on welfare were white women and white children, as opposed to the old Chicago welfare queen advocacy that we heard. And President Clinton, whom I often agreed with on almost everything, was pushing this legislation for Middle America. And so they had some things in the bill that I agreed with, but there are many things I disagreed with. And I told him that I couldn't vote for this bill. And all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus voted against it, and as did I. But in fact, I mean, it may have had some sweeteners in it, but I just could not stomach it, just do it. But there were times, and I can't recall specifically, where I did just have to take a bill and vote for it because I'd be voting against too many things in my district.
Really represented, or have we gotten away from that?
So the question really is twofold, right? About how do you represent all of the constituents in your district, and what impact has redistricting had on that process when lines get drawn for maybe political reasons and things, and it changes who's in your congressional district?
Good question. I have to refer to a little history about the 21st Congressional District, which is now the 11th Congressional District. When my brother Carl was state representative, he was the first black Democrat elected in Ohio to the Ohio legislature. And he had become so popular back in the early 60s that they were afraid that he was going to run for Congress in a state that never had a black congressperson. And so when the Ohio legislature in which he was serving redistricted the 21st Congressional District, they completely diluted the black strength in the district. They moved the blacks all over the district to dilute the strength so that Carl could not have a base. And so I represented the NAACP, and Carl brought the case to the NAACP, asked us to file a gerrymandering lawsuit. We filed a lawsuit, and we tried it in the lower court. We lost. We took it up to the United States Supreme Court, and we won the case. When the district was carved out as the United States Supreme Court required, the district came out 65% black, 35% white. So then at that point, I go to Carl and I say, Mayor, we won your case. I say, you can now go to Congress. Well, he had then become the first black mayor of a major American city. Cleveland was the 8th largest city in the United States at that time. Population in excess of 800,000 here, with only a minority population of about 37%. So it was not a black city. And so he said, I don't want to go to Congress. I'm the mayor of Cleveland. So then everybody in town, when they heard that Carl was not running for Congress, decided this was their time to go to Congress. Well, the NAACP came back to me and said, well, listen, you created the district, why don't you run? So we decided I should run. So I ran in a district that was 65% black, 35% white. Now I knew as a congressperson, with a district of that sort, the major problems, welfare, poverty, crime, were going to occur in the black part of that district. But at the same time, I had to represent the white side of the district too, because that's the only way to represent people, is you represent the entire district. And my constituents seem to understand that a lot of the rhetoric they heard from me and a lot of the things that I did applied to the black part of that district. But at no time were they able to say I neglected the white part of the district. I tried to merge that representation in there. And over the years, they continued to redistrict me and added to my district. You know, I was given Shaker Heights, and then Euclid, and then South Euclid, and the district was expanded over the years. They always kept the district. I think the final district I had was about 55% black. And, but at all times, I took pride in the fact that people throughout the district, white and black, commended the representation we gave.
Personal experience more beneficial or more detrimental to you being in Congress?
That's a great question. I couldn't begin to repeat all of that, but I do think it's an important point about growing up in Cleveland, growing up with your mother's influence and the hard work she did as a domestic worker and being on welfare, and that impacting your ability to work at making differences and solving problems as a legislator. And did that background actually affect you over time and how you got led as a congressional leader? Is that accurate?
Yes.
Oh.
Okay. Well, you know, as I look back and I understand how my mother raised two boys as a widow, and also had her mother in the house to try and take care of us when she had to stay on the job where she worked in homes in the suburbs, where she took care of the children and took care of their food and clothing and all that. And having come from that background and living in public housing, nobody has to explain a lot of things to me. I lived it, I understood it. And so it made it natural for me to be able to continue fighting for that kind of thing. That's why legislation I referred to in minority health, all of those are areas that I spent a great deal of time in legislation in and made a difference in. But if I'm answering your question right, nothing ever changed. I mean, I feel that way today. I'm still concerned in those areas. Now, am I answering your question?
Essentially, yes. I would just wonder, you know, coming from a different background than I'm sure of a lot of your peers, like as a professional in Congress, like how was it difficult? Was it an advantage for you sometimes? Did you ever feel behind or how it affected you in your career?
Can I add on to that question?
Mm-hmm.
And so that question, the follow-up is, did it affect you? Did you ever feel behind, or did you feel at odds with those who didn't come from that background? And I think the question I would ask is, that's because there's so much money involved in running for legislative positions. Is it even possible today for somebody with a more humble background to be able to make it into Congress? And what happens if there aren't any legislators who have that kind of background? Mm-hmm. And so,
yeah, I think for the former part of it, I think it was an advantage to some degree. When we would get into debate on issues of that sort, I could speak from my own background in that area. And we got a lot of attention, me and others who had similar backgrounds. And they would oftentimes, on issues of that sort, look to us for guidance and leadership, because they knew that was our background, and we had overcome and acquired educations and things that brought us far away from where we were, but that this was our background, which we had not forgotten, and where we could articulate it in a way that others could not. And to Professor Chupp's question, money is an evil in politics. If you don't think so, just go down to the plain dealer and look at all these stories they've written about corruption right here in our community. Over 60 public people, either, I guess 58 of them or so pled guilty. And just a story in this morning's paper about one who's just assigned to 8 years in prison for bribery. He gave out money to a whole lot of people and so forth. And so that exists, but you don't have to expose yourself to that. One thing I never have understood is people who take public money and are corrupt with public money. I just can't even conceive of how you do that. But it does take money to run for public office in America. And just recently I saw where the county executive was being asked about running for governor. And he said, it's going to take $20 million for me to run for governor. I mean, the governor's race is taking $20 million, and I don't know how much the governor gets paid, but for maybe a couple of $100,000 job, there's something wrong with that. Now, a district like mine was a poor district. It got a little better when I got Beechwood and Shaker Heights in it and places like that. It raised the ante up some, but basically it was a poor congressional district. There are districts in America today where, in New Jersey, for instance, Senator Corzine spent $60 million of his own money in his campaign. You can't compete against. You can't run for office against a person who can pull out that kind of money of their own before they even go to other people asking to help fund their campaigns. And the real answer, Professor, is that until Americans are willing to sponsor through federal funding campaigns, we will not be able to solve this problem, because private interests under the Supreme Court decision that was rendered in the Gore case that went to the United States Supreme Court, where they allow corporations to put any amount of money into campaigns. Well, if a corporation can put any amount of money into campaigns, ordinary and average candidate can't stand a chance.
Okay, I think we're close to the end of our time, and let's once again give our Congressman a great thank you for his great presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Thank you.